A millionaire stormed through his ex-wife's door like a hurricane made of entitlement, but the moment his eyes landed on the two small faces staring back at him, time stopped and his entire world shattered into pieces he'd never be able to put back together. Family, what he discovers in the next 60 seconds will force you to choose a side, and trust me, by the end of the story, you'll have strong opinions about whether redemption is even possible for men like this. A powerful story for my beautiful family. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to my channel. And may God cover every woman watching with protection from men who see you as property, with strength to raise your children in peace even when the world says you need a partner, and with blessings so abundant they prove you never needed what you walked away from. But listen, family, if you're not subscribed, you're gambling with missing stories that your soul needs to hear. So hit that subscribe button now, comment where you're watching from. And if subscription isn't for you, tell me why in the comments, because even resistance teaches us something. Now, my beautiful family, let's dive into the story. The door exploded inward like thunder splitting the sky, and Noah Bennett stood there drenched in rain and rage, his $1,000 suit clinging to his frame like a second skin made of fury. His chest heaved with the kind of anger that comes from a man who's never been told no, never been denied, never been made to feel small until tonight, until this very moment when he crossed that threshold ready to destroy the woman who dared disappear from his world without permission. Olivia turned slowly from the window where she'd been watching the storm, and in her arms were two sleeping infants wrapped in blue blankets, their tiny faces peaceful against her chest, and Noah's words died in his throat like a man drowning on dry land. The lightning cracked again and illuminated the room in white fire. And that's when he saw it. That's when his knees nearly buckled beneath 200 pounds of arrogance and entitlement, because one of those babies opened his eyes, and they were his eyes, the same steel gray that stared back at him every morning in the mirror when he convinced himself he was a king. His hands dropped to his sides, useless and heavy, and the silence between them stretched like a chasm filled with ghosts of everything he destroyed, every cruel word he'd thrown like daggers, every time he'd made her cry and called it love. Before we go deeper into this storm, family, I need you to do something right now, because what you're about to witness will shake you to your core. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss these stories, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this community is growing and you need to be part of it. Olivia didn't flinch, didn't retreat, didn't show him the fear he'd always fed on like a parasite feeds on blood. She stood there radiant in her simple cotton dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, holding those children like they were the only shield she'd ever need. And Noah realized with horror that he was the one trembling now. He was the one powerless. He was the one standing in judgment while she held the evidence of his greatest failure. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice calm as morning light. And those 4 words cut deeper than any scream could have, because they carried no emotion, no anger. Just the simple truth that he'd lost the right to enter her world the day he chose cruelty over compassion. He wanted to speak, wanted to demand answers, wanted to rage about why she never told him. But his mouth had forgotten how to form words, because his brain was spinning with calculations and timelines, and the devastating mathematics of realizing these weren't 1-month-old babies, but 5-month-old realities he'd missed. The second twin stirred against her shoulder, and Noah caught a glimpse of the same jawline he'd inherited from his father, the same stubborn chin that had helped him crush competitors and build empires. And now that genetic legacy stared back at him in miniature innocence, while his empire crumbled to dust in his mind. Thunder rolled across the sky, like God clearing his throat before judgment, and Noah took one step forward, then stopped when Olivia's eyes flashed warning. "How long have you known?" he whispered. And the question came out broken, pathetic, nothing like the commanding tone he'd used to make boardrooms submit and women beg. She adjusted one baby higher on her hip, and the movement was so practiced, so natural, so completely belonging to a life he'd never been part of. That jealousy burned through his chest like acid. "I've known since the day you told me I was nothing," she replied, and each word landed like a hammer on glass. "I've known since you used me to get to my brother's construction company. I've known since you laughed when I cried and called me weak for having feelings. I've known since I realized the man I loved was actually a monster wearing expensive cologne." Noah's hand reached out involuntarily toward the children, and Olivia stepped back smoothly, decisively, putting her body between him and them like a fortress made of flesh and maternal instinct. "You don't get to touch them," she said, and her voice carried the weight of every sleepless night, every moment she'd struggled alone, every time she'd been both mother and father while he'd been out building monuments to his own ego. Family, imagine standing face to face with your biggest mistake. Imagine seeing your own DNA wrapped in blankets, held by the woman whose heart you shattered. Imagine knowing you destroyed the only real thing you ever had. And ask yourself this: does a man like Noah Bennett deserve a second chance? Or should Olivia slam that door in his face forever? The wind howled through the open doorway behind him, and rain pooled at his feet like his pride melting into the floorboards, and Noah Bennett, the man who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, couldn't find a single word worthy of this moment. One of the twins made a small sound, a tiny whimper of discomfort, and Olivia immediately shifted, bouncing gently, humming something soft and sweet, completely ignoring the drenched millionaire standing in her living room like a beggar at heaven's gate. "I came here to tell you you're making a mistake," Noah finally managed, though his voice sounded foreign to his own ears. "I came here to remind you who I am, what I can provide, why you need me." Olivia's laugh was soft and devastating, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who survived drowning and learned to breathe underwater. "That's your problem, Noah," she said, moving toward the hallway with his children, his sons, his legacy in her arms. "You still think love is about need, about power, about what you can provide. But these boys will never know that version of love. They'll never know what it's like to be someone's transaction." She paused at the threshold of the hallway, backlit by a warm light that made her look like something holy, something he'd never deserved. And she looked at him one last time with eyes that held no hatred, no anger, just the peaceful indifference of someone who'd already grieved and healed. "If you want to know them," she said, "if you want to be anything more than the DNA that made them possible, you're going to have to prove you're capable of being human first. And Noah, I've seen what's inside you. I've seen the emptiness where your heart should be. So ask yourself if you're even capable of that kind of change." The twins had fallen back asleep against her, tiny fists curled against her collarbone, completely unaware that their father stood 10 feet away experiencing the first real emotion he'd felt in 36 years. Noah opened his mouth to argue, to negotiate, to do what he did best, which was manipulate and control. But Olivia had already turned away, already disappeared into the hallway with his sons, already closed a door somewhere deeper in the house, and he was left standing alone in her living room while the storm raged outside, and a different kind of storm built in his chest. But family, to understand how the mighty Noah Bennett ended up broken and begging in a suburban doorway, we need to go back 6 years, back to when he was still building his empire of ice, back to the moment a girl with kind eyes and coffee-stained hands accidentally walked into his perfectly controlled world and set fire to everything he thought he knew about power. 6 years earlier, Noah Bennett stood in the center of a ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and the stench of old money, his jaw tight as he watched investors grovel for his attention like dogs begging for scraps from a table they'd never sit at. He was 32 then, already worth more than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. But wealth had done nothing except teach him that people were transactions and emotions were liabilities best left to the weak. His $3,000 tuxedo fit like a second skin designed to intimidate, and when he moved through the crowd they parted instinctively because something in his eyes warned that he wasn't the kind of man you touched without permission. The charity gala was the usual performance of rich people pretending to care about poor people while spending enough on champagne to feed a neighborhood. And Noah attended only because his publicist insisted visibility was good for the company's image, even though he'd rather be closing deals than making small talk with socialites who'd inherited everything and earned nothing. She appeared out of nowhere like a glitch in his perfectly controlled environment, stumbling backward from a waiter's tray with a coffee cup tilting dangerously in her hand, and before Noah could step aside the entire contents splashed across his chest in a dark stain that spread like blood across white silk. The ballroom went silent as every head turned to witness the catastrophe, and Noah's face transformed into something carved from ice as he stared down at the ruin of his shirt while fury built behind his teeth. The girl gasped and her hands flew to her mouth, eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from knowing you've just destroyed something worth more than your rent. and she started apologizing in a voice that trembled like leaves before a storm. "I'm so sorry, I didn't see you. Please let me pay for the cleaning. I'm so incredibly sorry," she stammered, and her hands reached toward him with napkins she'd grabbed from a nearby table. But Noah caught her wrist midair with enough force to make her wince. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" he said, his voice low and dangerous, the kind of tone that had made grown men reconsider their life choices in boardrooms across 3 continents. She looked up at him with brown eyes that held no calculation, no agenda, just genuine remorse mixed with fear, and something about her complete lack of artifice caught him off guard because everyone in his world wore masks. But this girl's face was an open book written in a language he'd forgotten how to read. "I can replace it," she whispered, though they both knew she couldn't, knew that her entire outfit probably cost less than 1 button on his ruined shirt, and the asymmetry of power between them should have made him cruel, but instead made him curious. He released her wrist and stepped back, watching her fumble with the napkins while other guests whispered behind manicured hands. And Noah realized she wasn't part of this world at all, wasn't one of the trust fund parasites or social climbers. She was staff, maybe catering, definitely out of place among the diamonds and designer gowns. "What's your name?" he demanded. And the question came out harsher than intended, because gentleness had been beaten out of him years ago by a father who believed affection was weakness, and a mother who'd proven him right by disappearing when Noah was 10. "Olivia Grace," she said quietly, finally meeting his eyes with something that looked like defiance breaking through the fear, and he noticed for the first time that she was actually beautiful in an understated way, no makeup to speak of, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, the kind of natural that his usual companions spent thousands trying to fake. The moment stretched between them loaded with something undefined, and Noah felt the strangest urge to make her smile instead of cry, to prove he wasn't the monster everyone said he was, even though he absolutely was exactly that monster and worse. Family. Have you ever met someone who saw through your armor before you even knew you were wearing it? Someone whose innocence made you realize how corrupted you'd become? And if so, did you have the courage to walk away before you destroyed them? Or did you do what Noah did next and mistake possession for connection? He let her go with a curt nod and turned away, dismissing her from his attention the way he dismissed everyone who wasn't useful. But 3 days later, when his assistant showed him a portfolio of interior designers competing for his new penthouse project, there she was on page 7, Olivia Grace, with her earnest smile and modest credentials. And Noah made a decision that would unravel both their lives. He called her himself, bypassing his assistant. And when she answered the phone breathless and shocked that Noah Bennett personally wanted to discuss her proposal, he told himself it was just business. Told himself her coffee-stained apology had nothing to do with this choice. Told himself the way her voice had trembled with hope wasn't the reason his chest felt strange and tight. She arrived at his office the following Monday, wearing a dress that was professional but clearly secondhand, carrying design boards that showed more talent than money. And when she pitched her vision for his penthouse, her hands shook, but her ideas were solid, creative, completely different from the sterile luxury his other designers had proposed. Noah sat behind his desk, watching her nervous energy fill the room like light through a broken window. And somewhere deep in the cavity where his heart used to live something shifted, something dangerous, something that would eventually burn them both to ash, but in that moment felt almost like warmth. "You're hired," he said before she'd finished talking, and the joy that exploded across her face was so pure, so unguarded, that Noah felt himself smile for the first time in months. And family. That smile was the beginning of the end. The first crack in a dam that would eventually flood everything he'd built and leave him standing in a doorway years later begging for forgiveness from the ruins. The penthouse project became Noah's excuse to see her daily, and within 3 weeks, he'd crossed every professional boundary he'd ever pretended to respect, because Olivia's presence made the silence in his life feel less like peace and more like the tomb it actually was. He started buying her things casually at first. A new laptop because hers kept crashing during presentations. Then designer shoes because he claimed her worn flats made his marble floors look cheap. Then dresses that cost more than her monthly rent wrapped in boxes she'd find on her desk with notes that read, "Wear this tonight," like commands disguised as gifts. She accepted everything with wide-eyed gratitude that made him feel powerful and generous instead of recognizing that he was slowly building a cage out of cashmere and credit cards, trapping her in a web of dependency she wouldn't notice until it was too late to escape. Their first dinner happened on a Tuesday after she'd worked 16 hours straight perfecting the bedroom design, and Noah told himself it was just professional courtesy when he ordered his driver to take them to the most exclusive restaurant in the city where politicians and celebrities waited months for reservations he could get with a single phone call. She looked terrified and beautiful across the candlelit table, completely out of her element among the wine lists that cost more than cars and the waiters who spoke in French. And Noah found himself explaining dishes and making her laugh with stories about his first high society dinner when he'd been 19 and hungry, freshly rich, and completely clueless about which fork to use. That night he saw something flicker in her eyes when he drove her home, something soft and dangerous that looked suspiciously like affection. And instead of running from it like a smart man, he leaned closer and kissed her against her apartment door while rain started to fall and warning bells went off in the part of his brain that still remembered how to feel human. The relationship detonated into existence with the intensity of people who should know better but don't. And within a month Olivia had moved into his penthouse because he'd convinced her the commute was inefficient, even though the real reason was he couldn't sleep anymore without her breathing beside him in the darkness. He showered her with everything money could purchase, private jets to Paris for weekend getaways where they'd walk along the Seine, and she'd sketch buildings while he pretended to read contracts, but actually just watched her smile. Diamonds that glittered on her throat during gallery openings where she'd hold his arm and make him feel almost normal. Almost like a man capable of love instead of just sophisticated obsession. But Noah's version of love came with terms and conditions written in invisible ink that only revealed themselves when challenged. And the first time Olivia suggested meeting his business partners, wives, for lunch, he'd looked at her with eyes gone cold and said, "You're here to be beautiful and grateful, not to build a social circle." She'd flinched like he'd slapped her, and Noah had immediately softened his tone, pulled her close, whispered apologies against her hair, while his fingers traced patterns on her skin that felt like affection, but were actually just another form of control. Family, how many of you have loved someone who gave you everything except the one thing you actually needed, who could buy you the world but couldn't give you basic respect? And if you're honest, how long did you stay hoping they'd change before you realized hope was just another word for self-destruction? The cracks started small, moments when Noah would come home late smelling like perfume that wasn't hers and explain it away with business dinners she wasn't invited to. Phone calls he'd take in another room with his voice dropping to intimate whispers that stopped the second she entered. Olivia began finding evidence scattered through their life like breadcrumbs leading to a truth she didn't want to follow. Lipstick on his collar that was too red to be hers, receipts for hotel rooms on nights he'd claimed to be working at the office, text messages that lit up his phone screen with previews that made her stomach drop through the floor. She confronted him on a Thursday night after finding a woman's earring in his car, held it up between trembling fingers while tears tracked down her face, and Noah had barely looked up from his whiskey before saying, "You knew what this was when you moved in. Don't act surprised now that reality doesn't match your fairy tale." The cruelty in his voice was surgical, designed to hurt efficiently, and Olivia had stood there absorbing the blow while something fundamental inside her began to die because the man she'd fallen for had been a performance, and this monster sipping expensive liquor was the truth underneath. "I love you," she'd whispered like a prayer to a god who'd stopped listening, and Noah had laughed, actually laughed, the sound hollow and sharp as breaking glass. "Love is a story we tell ourselves to justify bad decisions," he'd said, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "You love what I provide. The security, the luxury, the way other women look at you with envy when you're on my arm. So let's not pretend this is some grand romance when it's really just a mutually beneficial arrangement." She'd left the room then, locked herself in the bathroom and cried until her throat was raw. And through the door she could hear him on a phone call laughing about something unrelated, completely unbothered by the devastation he'd just caused because Noah Bennett had learned long ago that caring about other people's pain was a luxury he couldn't afford. The next morning she woke to a diamond bracelet on her pillow with a note that said "Forgive me" in his sharp handwriting. And the worst part wasn't that he thought jewelry could erase cruelty. The worst part was that she put it on anyway, because leaving meant going back to her cramped studio apartment and 3 jobs and the constant terror of not making rent. So she stayed, and staying meant watching pieces of herself disappear like stars being swallowed by a black hole, meant smiling at charity events while he barely touched her, meant lying awake at 3 in the morning wondering when exactly she'd traded her self-respect for Egyptian cotton sheets, and a closet full of clothes she'd never wanted. Noah treated her devotion like a renewable resource he could drain without consequence, taking her presence for granted the way rich men take everything for granted. And when she tried to talk about their future, about children or marriage or any kind of commitment beyond his lease on her body and time, he'd shut down completely, his face going blank as unmarked snow. "You mean nothing outside my rules, Olivia," he told her once during a fight she couldn't even remember starting. And those words had branded themselves across her heart like a cattle mark claiming ownership of something that deserved freedom instead. And family. That's when she should have run. Should have packed her bags and disappeared. But love makes fools of the wisest people, and she was so deep in the trap by then that escape felt impossible. The final betrayal arrived on a Wednesday evening when Olivia came home early from a design consultation and found Noah's phone lighting up on the kitchen counter with messages that shredded whatever remained of her illusions. Texts from a woman named Veronica discussing last night's hotel room and next week's trip to the Maldives that Olivia had foolishly believed was meant for them. She stood there reading evidence of her own irrelevance while her hand shook so badly the phone nearly slipped through her fingers. And when Noah walked in 30 minutes later fresh from the gym with his hair still damp, he took one look at her face and knew exactly what had happened, but didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "So you went to my phone," he said, grabbing a bottle of water from the refrigerator like they were discussing the weather instead of the systematic destruction of her heart. And the casual indifference in his voice was somehow worse than anger would have been, because at least anger would have meant he felt something. Olivia's voice came out steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest, and she asked him the question she already knew the answer to. Asked if Veronica was the only one, or if there were others. Asked if anything between them had ever been real, or if she'd been auditioning for a role in his life that was never actually available. Noah leaned against the counter and studied her with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen, then took a long drink of water before answering, with words designed to inflict maximum damage in minimum time. "You knew what this was from the beginning," he said, his eyes flat and reptilian in the track lighting. "I never promised you forever, never promised you fidelity, never promised you anything except a comfortable life in exchange for your presence. And you accepted those terms, so don't stand there acting like I violated some contract we never signed." She felt something crack inside her then, some final weight-bearing wall collapsing into rubble, and the clarity that came with destruction was almost beautiful, because suddenly she could see everything she'd been too close to recognize. "You're right," Olivia said quietly. And Noah's eyebrows lifted slightly because he'd expected tears or accusations, expected her to beg or bargain the way she always did when he pushed her away. "I did accept those terms. I let you convince me that scraps from your table were better than nothing. I let you train me to be grateful for the bare minimum, while you gave other women the parts of yourself I was stupid enough to think were mine." She walked past him toward the bedroom while he watched with a mixture of surprise and calculation, already planning whatever combination of gifts and manipulation would bring her back to heel, because that's how this dance always ended. But when she emerged 20 minutes later with a suitcase and her design portfolio, he realized with dawning alarm that this time might actually be different, that he'd finally pushed hard enough to break the leash instead of just tightening it. "Where do you think you're going?" Noah demanded, positioning himself between her and the door like a wall made of entitlement and expensive cologne, and his hand shot out to grab her arm, but she twisted away with surprising strength. "Anywhere that isn't here," she replied, her voice carrying a quiet dignity that made him angrier than screaming would have, because dignity meant she still had power, and he needed her powerless to maintain control. He tried a different tactic then, softening his expression into something approximating concern, reaching for her with open palms and words wrapped in honey instead of barbed wire. "Olivia, be reasonable. Where will you go? How will you survive? Everything you have is because of me, and you're going to throw it away over what? Jealousy, insecurity, the childish need to be someone's only option instead of their best one." Each word was calculated to make her doubt herself, to remind her of the poverty she'd escaped by accepting his terms, to trap her with fear disguised as logic. Family, imagine the moment you finally realize that leaving will hurt less than staying, that poverty is preferable to being someone's convenient option, that sleeping on a friend's couch beats sleeping beside someone who sees you as furniture. And ask yourself this: would you have Olivia's strength to walk away, or would you stay for the comfort even knowing the cost? She looked at him standing there in his designer athletic, where that cost more than most people's car payments, blocking her exit like he owned not just the penthouse, but her right to leave it. And something in her face must have warned him that his usual tricks weren't working, because panic flickered across his features for just a second before the mask settled back into place. "You'll regret this," he said, dropping the pretense of caring and letting the threat hang naked in the air between them. "You'll be back in a week begging for another chance, and I might not be feeling generous." Olivia shifted her suitcase to her other hand and met his eyes with the calm of someone who'd already survived the worst thing that could happen and discovered they were still breathing. "The only thing I regret," she said, moving around him toward the door, "is wasting 2 years on a man who confused cruelty with strength and possession with love. But don't worry, Noah. I'm sure Veronica, or whoever comes after her, will be happy to fill the position, at least until they realize what I just figured out." He demanded to know what revelation she thought she'd had, demanded it with the voice he used in boardrooms when subordinates forgot their place. But Olivia was already opening the door, already stepping into the hallway, already leaving behind the prison of marble and luxury and emotional starvation. "Bet you're not a man," she said softly as the elevator doors opened. "You're just a scared little boy playing dress-up in his dead father's suit. And the saddest part is you don't even know it." The elevator doors closed on his stunned face, and Olivia rode down 43 floors, while her reflection in the mirrored walls showed someone she barely recognized, hollow-eyed and thin from months of walking on eggshells around his moods. She'd called her friend Rachel before leaving, the one person from her old life she'd managed to stay in contact with despite Noah's subtle attempts to isolate her from anyone who might remind her she deserved better. Rachel answered on the second ring and said, "It's about damn time," when Olivia explained through tears that she'd finally left, and 20 minutes later she was on Rachel's worn couch drinking cheap wine that tasted better than anything from Noah's temperature-controlled cellar, because it came with actual friendship instead of emotional price tags. The first week was agony. Nights spent sobbing into pillows that smelled wrong, mornings waking up to remember all over again that she'd chosen dignity over comfort. Days filled with the grinding practicality of rebuilding a life from rubble, while her body ached for the familiar, even though the familiar had been slowly killing her. But somewhere around day 10 something shifted. Some weight lifted that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying, and Olivia woke up thinking about fabric samples instead of Noah's, schedule about her own projects instead of his preferences, and the freedom tasted like oxygen after years of breathing through a straw. She started taking freelance design jobs, small at first, a living room here and a bedroom there. But her talent had always been real, even if his treatment ever hadn't been. And word spread that Olivia Grace was available and affordable and brilliant. Subscribe now, family, because what Noah doesn't know yet is that walking away was just the beginning. And the real story starts in Chapter 5, when his carefully constructed empire begins to crumble. 3 months of silence stretched between them like a demilitarized zone until Noah's name lit up Olivia's phone screen on a Tuesday night while she was sketching floor plans at Rachel's kitchen table. And her heart betrayed her by jumping before her brain could remind it that this man had treated her like replaceable furniture. She let it ring through to voicemail twice before curiosity, and that poisonous thing called hope made her answer on the third attempt. And Noah's voice came through rough and humble in a way she'd never heard before, asking if they could meet for coffee because he had things to say that couldn't be said through a phone. Olivia's first instinct was to refuse, to protect the fragile peace she'd built from the wrecking ball of his presence. But some self-destructive part of her wanted to believe people could change, wanted to believe the fairy tale where the beast learns remorse and transforms into something worthy of beauty's forgiveness. She agreed to meet him at a neutral cafe the following afternoon, and spent the entire night alternating between rehearsing speeches about boundaries and fantasizing about apologies that would somehow make the past 2 years worth surviving. Noah showed up 15 minutes early, looking deliberately disheveled in a way that probably took an hour to perfect. His usual armor of expensive suits replaced with jeans and a sweater that made him look approachable, almost vulnerable. And when he stood to greet her, his eyes held a sadness that seemed genuine enough to lower her defenses. He apologized with words that sounded rehearsed but felt sincere, talking about therapy sessions and realizations about his childhood trauma, about how losing her had forced him to confront the emptiness he'd been running from since his mother walked out when he was 10 years old. Olivia listened while her coffee went cold, wanting to believe the transformation, wanting to trust that pain could actually teach people instead of just making them better liars. And when he reached across the table to take her hand, she didn't pull away, even though warning bells were going off in the part of her brain that remembered how good he was at performing whatever role the situation required. "I'm not asking you to come back," Noah said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I'm just asking for a chance to prove I can be the man you deserved all along, even if that man never gets to hold you again." The courtship that followed was everything their first relationship hadn't been. Slow and gentle with actual dates instead of transactions. Conversations that lasted hours instead of commands disguised as compliments. And Noah played the reformed sinner so convincingly that even Rachel started to think maybe he'd actually changed. He sent flowers with handwritten notes instead of jewelry, with price tags, remembered her favorite books and showed up with signed copies, asked about her work with genuine interest instead of dismissive tolerance. And Olivia felt herself falling again despite every lesson the past had tried to teach her. Family. How many of you have given someone a second chance knowing in your gut it was a mistake, knowing that people don't fundamentally change, but wanting so badly to be wrong that you ignored every red flag waving in the wind? 2 months into their reconciliation, Noah mentioned casually over dinner that he was working on a massive development deal, but was struggling to find a reliable construction partner. And Olivia made the fatal mistake of mentioning her brother Marcus, who ran a mid-sized construction firm that had been trying to break into major commercial projects for years. Noah's eyes had flickered with something she couldn't quite read, gone so fast she almost missed it, and he'd asked with studied casualness if she thought Marcus might be interested in meeting to discuss potential collaboration. She'd been thrilled at the idea of helping both men she cared about, had set up the meeting herself, had sat in her brother's office beaming with pride while Noah and Marcus negotiated terms for $1 billion mixed-use development that would make her brother's career and cement Noah's empire. The contract was signed 3 weeks later at a celebration dinner where champagne flowed and Marcus kept thanking his sister for bringing this opportunity into his life. And Noah had kissed Olivia's temple with what she thought was affection, but was actually satisfaction at a plan executed perfectly. The mask stayed in place for exactly 4 days after the ink dried, long enough that she wouldn't immediately connect his cruelty to her usefulness expiring. And then Noah invited her to his penthouse ostensibly to celebrate their fresh start with a home-cooked dinner he'd prepared himself. She arrived with wine and hope, dressed in a simple sundress because he'd always preferred her understated, and found him standing at the window with his back to her, hands in his pockets, the posture of a man about to deliver bad news he didn't actually feel bad about. "We're done, Olivia," he said without turning around, his voice flat and businesslike, and she'd laughed nervously thinking it was some kind of joke until he finally faced her with eyes gone cold as January. "I got what I needed," he continued, gesturing vaguely toward papers on his desk that she realized with dawning horror were the construction contract her brother had signed. "Your brother's firm gives me the local connections and political leverage I've been missing. So thank you for that, truly. You've been incredibly useful." The wine bottle slipped from her fingers and shattered on his marble floor, red spreading like arterial blood. And Olivia couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process that she'd been played again, but worse this time, because he'd used her family as pawns in whatever sick game he was always playing. "You told me you changed," she whispered, and her voice sounded distant like it was coming from underwater. "You said you were in therapy. You said you'd realized what you'd lost." Noah poured himself whiskey and settled into his leather chair with the satisfied expression of a chess master announcing checkmate. "I did realize what I lost," he agreed, swirling the amber liquid. "I lost a convenient connection to the construction industry. And then I got it back even better than before. So really you should be proud. You facilitated a deal that will make me another $100 million by next quarter." She wanted to scream or hit him or burn his penthouse down with him inside it, wanted to hurt him the way he'd hurt her, but all she could manage was standing there while her heart shattered into pieces, so small they'd never fit back together. Family, what's worse, being betrayed once by someone's true nature or being betrayed twice by someone weaponizing your hope? And does a man like Noah Bennett deserve to breathe the same air as decent people, or should karma come for him swift and merciless? Olivia left without another word because there was nothing to say to a predator who just admitted he'd been hunting you all along. And she made it to the street before the tears came, made it to Rachel's apartment before the screaming started. Made it through that first night only because Rachel held her while she sobbed and swore she'd never be stupid enough to trust another man's apology again. The next 3 days passed in a blur of grief and rage, Olivia barely eating, not sleeping, just staring at walls while her brain replayed every moment of the past 5 months, searching for clues she'd missed, red flags she'd ignored, evidence that she was fundamentally broken for falling for the same trap twice. On the 4th morning, she woke up dizzy and nauseous, stumbled to the bathroom, and vomited until her ribs ached. And when Rachel suggested maybe she should see a doctor, Olivia snapped that she didn't need medical attention for a broken heart. But the nausea persisted through the week, and the exhaustion got worse instead of better. And finally Rachel made the appointment herself and physically dragged Olivia to the clinic, because sometimes friends have to save you from yourself when you've given up on survival. The doctor was kind and efficient, running tests while asking routine questions about her cycle and symptoms. And when she came back into the examination room, her expression was carefully neutral in that way medical professionals practice for delivering life-altering news. "You're pregnant," she said gently, and Olivia heard the words, but they didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense, because the universe wasn't cruel enough to tie her to Noah Bennett forever through a child conceived during his elaborate con. But the universe was exactly that cruel. And the follow-up ultrasound revealed not one, but 2 heartbeats flickering on the screen like tiny stars in the darkness. Twins growing inside her from the man who just finished proving he was incapable of love. And Olivia sat in that examination room, while her entire future rewrote itself in ways that terrified and transformed her simultaneously. Olivia stood on Rachel's balcony that night with her phone in one hand and Noah's number on the screen, her thumb hovering over the call button, while 2 lives smaller than poppy seeds grew inside her body and rewrote every plan she'd ever made for her future. Part of her wanted to tell him out of spite, wanted to watch him squirm with the consequences of his actions, wanted to force him to choose between his precious freedom and the biological reality of his own DNA multiplying in someone else's womb. But the stronger part, the part that had survived his cruelty twice and was determined not to give him a third opportunity, deleted his number entirely and made a choice that would redirect the entire trajectory of her existence. She would have these babies alone, would raise them without his money or his name or his poisonous influence, would prove that love didn't require a father who treated people like chess pieces in games only he understood how to play. Rachel found her there an hour later, staring at nothing. And when Olivia explained her decision, her friend had hugged her hard enough to crack ribs while whispering, "Those kids will be so lucky to have you as their warrior." The first trimester was brutal, morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that made lifting her head feel like moving mountains, and the constant terror that she couldn't do this alone, couldn't afford diapers and daycare and everything babies needed when she was barely keeping herself fed. But Olivia was her mother's daughter, and her mother had raised 3 children on a waitress salary after their father died, had taught her that strength wasn't about never falling down, but about getting back up with more determination than before. She took every freelance design job she could manage between bathroom visits, saved every dollar, researched every assistance program, and slowly built a foundation solid enough to support the family she was creating from the wreckage of her worst mistakes. At 4 months, her belly started showing, and she had to buy new clothes from thrift stores, elastic waistpants, and loose shirts that hid the evidence of her condition from clients who might judge a single-woman designer as unreliable. The ultrasound that revealed she was carrying twins instead of one baby should have terrified her, but instead filled her with a strange peace, because 2 seemed right somehow. Seemed like the universe was balancing the scales by giving her double the love to compensate for all the emptiness Noah had left behind. She started talking to them at night, one hand on each side of her expanding stomach, telling them stories about the life they'd have, the adventures they'd go on, the kind of man their father wasn't, so they'd know what to avoid when they grew up and started making their own choices about who deserved their hearts. Family, isn't it strange how the worst thing that ever happened to you can also give birth to the best thing? How pain and beauty can share the same address inside your body? And if you're honest, would you trade the scars if it meant losing the gifts they brought? By month 6, Olivia had saved enough to leave the city entirely, to disappear into a small coastal town 3 hours north where rent was affordable, and nobody knew her history or asked questions about the missing father. She found a modest 2-bedroom house with a view of the ocean, close enough to hear waves at night, far enough from Noah's world that she could finally breathe without tasting his cologne in the air. The nursery came together slowly. Furniture from garage sales, painted in soft colors, stuffed animals from discount stores, everything secondhand except the cribs, because she'd read that babies needed safe sleep surfaces, and compromising their safety to save money was a line she wouldn't cross. Her brother Marcus called weekly, guilty, and apologetic about his role in Noah's scheme, even though Olivia had forgiven him the moment she'd explained what happened. And he sent money she was too proud to accept until he threatened to show up and install himself on her couch if she didn't let him help. The night her water broke, she was alone, 2 weeks early, standing in her kitchen making tea, when the first contraction hit like a fist to her spine, and for one terrifying moment she thought about calling Noah, because despite everything he deserved to know, he was becoming a father. But then the second contraction came and she remembered his eyes when he'd admitted using her, remembered the casual cruelty in his voice, and she called Rachel instead, who arrived 90 minutes later to drive her to the hospital, while Olivia breathed through pain that felt like her body was splitting in half. Labor lasted 14 hours, each contraction a reminder that love costs something, that bringing life into the world requires paying in blood and sweat and agony that no painkiller can completely erase. The first twin emerged screaming at dawn, a boy with dark hair and lungs that announced his arrival to the entire maternity ward, and Olivia held him against her chest while tears streamed down her face because he was perfect. He was hers. He was the best thing she'd ever made from the worst relationship she'd ever survived. The second twin followed 20 minutes later, quieter but just as beautiful. Another boy with the same dark hair and the disturbing realization that he had Noah's exact nose, Noah's chin, Noah's eyes that would haunt her every time she looked at her sons' faces. She named them Eli and Aaron after her grandfathers, names that meant strength and light, names that had nothing to do with the man whose DNA they carried, but whose influence she was determined to keep out of their lives. The first week home was chaos. 2 babies who slept in shifts, so she never slept at all, diapers and bottles, and the constant fear that she was doing everything wrong, that her love wouldn't be enough to compensate for the father-shaped hole in their lives. But slowly rhythm emerged from disorder, and Olivia discovered she was capable of functioning on 3 hours of sleep, capable of feeding 2 mouths while ignoring her own hunger, capable of loving with an intensity that made her previous relationship look like a shallow puddle compared to an ocean. Rachel visited weekly, bringing groceries and staying to hold babies, while Olivia showered or napped or just sat in silence, remembering who she used to be before motherhood rewrote her identity. Her design business continued remotely. Clients who didn't mind that consultations happened with babies visible in the background. And Olivia became an expert at sketching floor plans one-handed, while a twin nursed at her breast. The months blurred together, milestones marked by their development rather than calendar pages, first smiles and first teeth, and the terrifying beauty of watching 2 humans learn to exist in a world that would sometimes be cruel, but would always have her standing between them and whatever tried to hurt them. At 6 months, she looked at herself in the mirror, at the stretch marks and exhaustion and the fierce joy in her eyes, and realized she'd never been happier despite having less money and more responsibility than any point in her previous existence. Family, tell me, isn't motherhood the closest thing we have to proof that humans are capable of supernatural love, that we can create life from nothing and sustain it through pure, well, even when everything else falls apart? She thought about Noah sometimes late at night when the twins finally slept and silence pressed against her ears, wondered if he ever thought about her, if guilt ever found him in quiet moments, if he'd changed at all or just moved on to his next victim. But those thoughts came less frequently as months became a year, and her life without him became more real than her life with him had ever been. And Olivia made peace with the fact that her sons would grow up with questions she couldn't fully answer about the man who gave them life but refused to give them love. She built a good existence in that small coastal town, friends who didn't judge, clients who appreciated her work, a community that embraced a single mother with twins and never asked about the father who was conspicuously absent from every family photo and school form that required his name. While Olivia was learning the sacred mathematics of splitting her heart between two tiny humans, Noah Bennett was drowning in the empire he'd built from other people's broken trust. And Karma was sharpening her knives in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He'd replaced Olivia within weeks of discarding her, this time with Vanessa Chun, a venture capitalist with legs that went for days and eyes that calculated profit margins while pretending to calculate affection. And Noah congratulated himself on upgrading to someone who understood that love was just another market commodity to be traded at optimal value. Vanessa moved into his penthouse with designer luggage and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. And for 6 months, Noah believed he'd finally found someone who matched his sophistication, someone who didn't burden him with emotions or expectations beyond the transactional arrangement they'd silently agreed upon. She had access to his accounts within 3 months because Noah's pattern was always the same: seduce with luxury, then lower defenses with false intimacy. And Vanessa played her role so perfectly that he never noticed her photographing documents or copying passwords or systematically building a complete map of his financial empire. The first sign something was wrong came on a Wednesday morning when Noah tried to transfer funds for a property acquisition and discovered his primary account had been drained to exactly $1, a deliberate insult that screamed premeditation rather than error. He'd called his bank in a rage that made his assistant step backward, only to learn that the transfers had been authorized with his own security credentials, routed through a series of shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and the woman who'd executed them was currently unreachable at a luxury resort in Dubai that didn't have extradition treaties with the United States. Vanessa had taken $73 million in a single night, money that represented years of ruthless deals and crushed competitors. And she'd left behind only a handwritten note on his pillow that said, "You taught me that people are just resources to be exploited. Consider this your final lesson." Noah stood in his empty penthouse, holding that note while his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a man who'd finally been beaten at his own game. And the irony would have been beautiful if it wasn't destroying him in real time. The media caught the story within 48 hours because scandals involving millionaires and beautiful con artists sell papers, and suddenly Noah Bennett's name was attached to headlines that used words like duped and victim and cautionary tale, words that turned him from predator to prey in the public consciousness. Business partners who'd tolerated his cruelty when he was winning started distancing themselves now that he looked weak. Investors pulled funding from projects that suddenly seemed risky, and Noah watched his empire crack like expensive china hitting marble floors. Family, why is it that we only recognize karma when it's happening to us? And does a man who built his fortune on manipulating others deserve sympathy when manipulation finally comes for him? Or should we just sit back and watch justice work in ways the legal system never could? The lawsuit started next, former employees emboldened by his public humiliation, filing complaints about workplace harassment and wage theft. Women he'd used and discarded coming forward with stories that painted him as exactly the monster he'd always been. And Noah's lawyers worked overtime trying to contain fires that kept multiplying faster than they could extinguish. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, spent his nights staring at spreadsheets, trying to calculate how to rebuild from ruins, while his days dissolved into depositions and damage control meetings that accomplished nothing except draining his remaining resources. The penthouse that had once felt like a throne room started feeling like a tomb, empty and cold and haunted by ghosts of everyone he destroyed on his way to the top. And for the first time in his adult life, Noah understood what loneliness actually meant beyond just the absence of company. His father's voice echoed in his memory during the worst moments. That harsh rasp that had taught him feelings were weakness and compassion was for people too stupid to take what they wanted. And Noah realized with devastating clarity that he'd become exactly what his father had made him, and that inheritance was worth less than nothing. 3 months after Vanessa disappeared, his company filed for bankruptcy protection. A humiliation that made headlines and spawned think pieces about toxic masculinity and corporate greed. and Noah had to sell the penthouse along with most of his possessions just to cover legal fees and outstanding debts. He moved into a modest apartment in a neighborhood that would have horrified his previous self, surrounded by normal people with normal problems, and the anonymity should have been liberating, but instead felt like erasure. Late one night, while scrolling through his phone looking for someone to call, anyone who might still care whether he lived or died, Noah found himself staring at an old photo of Olivia from their first month together when she'd still believed in him, when her smile had been genuine instead of forced, and something in his chest cracked open like ice breaking in spring. She'd been real in a way no one else had ever been, had loved him despite having every reason not to, had given him chances he'd systematically destroyed because he'd been too damaged to recognize salvation when it was sleeping beside him. Noah tried to find her through social media, but she'd disappeared completely. No digital footprint, no mutual connections. Just gone like she'd never existed except as proof that he was capable of destroying anything good that touched his life. He hired a private investigator on credit he couldn't afford, desperate for something he couldn't name. And when the report came back 2 weeks later, he sat in his empty apartment reading about Olivia's new life in a coastal town 3 hours north, where she ran a successful design business and lived in a modest house. And there at the bottom of the report was the detail that stopped his heart completely. Subject lives with twin sons, approximately 18 months old, names Eli and Aaron. Father unknown, but children bear striking resemblance to client based on provided photos. The words blurred as Noah read them again, then a fourth time, because his brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing, and suddenly every moment of their relationship was recontextualizing itself through this new, devastating lens. She'd been pregnant when he'd thrown her away, had carried his children while he'd celebrated his freedom, had given birth alone while he'd been busy being robbed by karma wearing designer heels. Noah dropped the report, and his hands were shaking, actually shaking like he was coming apart at a molecular level, because he'd missed everything, had walked past the only thing that mattered while chasing things that meant nothing. Family. Imagine discovering you're a father only after you've lost everything else. Imagine realizing the woman you destroyed was raising your legacy in silence while you were busy destroying yourself. And ask yourself honestly, does he deserve a chance to know those children, or should Olivia keep them protected from the man who proved he's poison to everything he touches? The photo attached to the report showed Olivia at a playground pushing 2 small boys on swings, and even in the grainy surveillance image Noah could see it, could see his own features replicated in miniature on their faces, could see the life he'd abandoned without knowing it existed. He sat in that apartment until sunrise planning what he'd say, how he'd apologize, what combination of words might make her understand that he'd changed because losing everything had finally taught him what everything actually meant. The rational part of his brain knew he had no right to disrupt her peace, knew she'd built a life specifically to exclude him, knew that showing up would be selfish and potentially destructive. But Noah Bennett had never been good at putting other people's needs before his own wants, and knowing he had children growing up without him felt like having his chest carved open with a dull knife. So he made a decision that would bring us back to where we started, back to a stormy night and a door kicked open and 2 sleeping infants that would force him to finally face the man he'd become. Noah drove through the storm like a man possessed, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, while rain hammered his windshield and thunder provided percussion for the chaos screaming through his head. Because 3 hours was too long to sit with the knowledge that he'd fathered children he'd never held and destroyed the only woman who'd ever seen past his armor to the broken thing underneath. The address from the investigator's report glowed on his phone GPS, leading him away from the city's steel and glass into suburbs that got progressively quieter until he pulled onto a street lined with modest houses that probably cost less than his former monthly parking fee, and the contrast between her world and his old one felt like an accusation written in architecture. He sat in the car for 10 minutes outside her house, watching lights glow warm through curtains, imagining the life happening inside those walls, the bedtime routines and goodnight kisses, and all the ordinary magic he'd missed, while building monuments to his own emptiness. Rage gave him the courage to move when logic would have sent him home. Rage at Olivia for hiding his sons. Rage at himself for being the kind of man she'd needed to hide them from. And he was out of the car and up the walkway before his brain could supply all the reasons this was a terrible idea. His fist hit the door hard enough to rattle the frame, but not hard enough to break it. And when no one answered immediately, his patience evaporated into the rain-soaked night, and he hit it again, harder, his voice rising to shout her name like he had any right to demand her attention after everything he'd done. The lock clicked and the door swung inward, revealing Olivia backlit by soft lamplight with 2 babies cradled against her chest. And Noah's entire universe collapsed into that single frame, into the undeniable reality of his genetic legacy staring at him through eyes he recognized from his own mirror every morning. Time stopped, or maybe just fragmented into pieces too small to measure, while his brain tried to process what his heart already knew, that these were his sons, his blood, his chance at redemption, or his final proof that he destroyed everything he touched, depending on what happened in the next 60 seconds. One of the twins blinked awake and focused on Noah with an expression of infant confusion, and the resemblance was so striking that Olivia might as well have copied and pasted his features onto a smaller canvas, and Noah felt his knees start to buckle under the weight of everything he'd lost before he even knew he had it to lose. "They're mine," he whispered, and it wasn't a question, because questions implied doubt, and there was none. Just certainty crashing through him like a tidal wave made of regret, and something that felt dangerously close to love. Olivia's face revealed nothing, no anger or fear or vindication, just the calm of someone who'd already fought their worst battles and come out the other side holding everything that mattered. "DNA doesn't make you a father," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the space between them with surgical precision. "Showing up after 18 months doesn't erase the 18 months you weren't here. And breaking down my door doesn't prove anything except that you're still the same man who thinks force is an acceptable substitute for earning things." Each word landed like a punch to his solar plexus, true and devastating. And Noah wanted to argue, but his mouth had forgotten how to form defenses, because she was right. She was absolutely right. And standing there drenched and desperate, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who'd spent his whole life taking and had finally run out of things to steal. Family. Imagine being Olivia in this moment. Imagine the man who shattered you standing in your doorway, demanding access to the children you've protected and raised alone. And tell me honestly, would you slam the door in his face? Or would some part of you still hope he'd finally learned what it means to be human? Thunder rolled overhead, and the twin in Olivia's left arm started to fuss, making small sounds of discomfort, and she immediately adjusted her hold while humming something soft that Noah couldn't hear, but could see working as the baby settled back against her shoulder. The gesture was so natural, so practiced, so completely belonging to a language of love he'd never learned to speak. And jealousy burned through Noah's chest, because she knew their sons in ways he never would, knew their sounds and needs and preferences, knew how to comfort them with just the rhythm of her heartbeat, while he stood there useless and obsolete. "I came to tell you that you can't keep them from me," Noah said, though his voice lacked the authority it once carried in boardrooms. "I have rights, legal rights, and you had no business making this decision without me." Olivia's laugh was soft and sharp as broken glass, the sound of someone who'd heard threats before and learned they were just noise from frightened men. "You want to discuss rights?" she replied, shifting both twins higher on her hips. "Let's discuss my right to not have my children raised by a man who treated their mother like a business transaction. Let's discuss their right to grow up without learning that love is something you weaponize. Let's discuss your right to walk away twice, and then show up demanding a relationship you never earned." Each point hit its target with the accuracy of someone who'd spent months preparing for this confrontation in her head, and Noah had no counterargument, because the truth was its own defense. He took a step forward and watched Olivia's entire body tense, watched her position herself between him and the babies like a fortress made of maternal instinct and justified distrust, and the realization that she saw him as a threat to their children hurt worse than Vanessa's betrayal or his company's bankruptcy or any financial loss he'd ever suffered. "I'm not here to hurt them," Noah said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just needed to see them, needed to know if they were real or if I'd finally lost my mind along with everything else." Something flickered across Olivia's face then, not softening exactly, but maybe recognition that the man standing in her doorway was different from the one who'd discarded her, diminished somehow, stripped of the arrogance that used to precede him like cologne. "What happened to you?" she asked, and the question carried no sympathy, just curiosity about how the mighty had apparently fallen. And Noah almost laughed, because where would he even start? With Vanessa's theft, or his company's collapse, or the moment he'd looked at his empty life and realized he'd traded everything real for things that meant nothing. I got exactly what I deserved, he said simply, and the admission cost him something, required setting down pride that had been his shield since childhood. I spent my whole life taking from people and calling it success, and the universe finally sent someone who took from me, and losing everything taught me what I'd actually lost when I lost you. The words hung between them heavy with truth that didn't automatically equal forgiveness. And Olivia studied him with eyes that had learned to see through performances to the reality underneath. "Those are pretty words, Noah," she said, and her tone suggested she'd heard pretty words before and watched them dissolve into ugly actions. But these boys don't need pretty words. They need consistency and safety, and a father who shows up not because he finally has nothing better to do, but because they're the only thing worth doing. One of the twins grabbed a fistful of her hair and pulled, and Olivia gently extracted his fingers while pressing a kiss to his forehead, and the casual intimacy of the gesture reminded Noah that he was a stranger to his own children, that biology meant nothing compared to the daily work of loving someone helpless who depended on you for everything. "Tell me what I have to do," Noah said, and it came out as begging, because that's what it was. Tell me how to prove I've changed, how to earn the right to know them. How to be the father they deserve instead of the one my genetics suggest I'll be. Olivia looked at him for a long moment, while rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance sirens wailed for someone else's emergency. And Noah held his breath, waiting for judgment from the only person whose opinion had ever actually mattered. "If you want them," she said finally, each word measured and deliberate, "you'll have to earn it. And Noah, earning means showing up every day even when it's hard, means putting their needs before your pride, means proving through actions, not promises, that you're capable of being more than the man who taught me that love was just another word for control." She stepped back from the doorway, but didn't invite him in, the space between them still a demilitarized zone that required negotiation rather than invasion. "I'll do it," Noah said immediately, desperately. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'll prove I can be what they need." Olivia shifted the sleeping twins in her arms, and something in her expression suggested she'd heard similar promises before and watched them evaporate like morning fog. Subscribe now, family, because what Olivia says next will change everything. We'll set conditions Noah never imagined. We'll test whether this broken man can actually rebuild himself into something worthy of the life he abandoned. Olivia's next words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would reshape everything Noah thought he understood about redemption and sacrifice, and what it actually cost to earn back something you'd thrown away like garbage. "You'll start by leaving," she said, and Noah's face collapsed because he'd expected conditions he could negotiate, terms he could meet, not immediate rejection disguised as testing. "You'll go back to wherever you came from, and you'll get your life together. Find a job, find a therapist, find whatever version of yourself exists underneath the wreckage. And when you're stable, when you're healthy, when you're someone I'd actually trust around my children, then maybe we'll talk about supervised visits." The parameters felt impossible, a mountain too steep to climb for a man who'd just lost everything. But Noah nodded, because what choice did he have except to accept her terms or walk away forever? And walking away would prove he was still the same man who'd walked away before. 6 months crawled by like years, while Noah rebuilt himself from foundation up, taking a job as a project manager at a mid-level construction firm where nobody knew his name or his history. Working 60-hour weeks not for empire building, but just to prove he understood what labor actually meant. He found a therapist who didn't let him hide behind excuses or blame his childhood, who made him sit with the uncomfortable truth that he'd chosen cruelty when kindness was always available, who taught him that acknowledging damage didn't erase responsibility for the damage he'd caused. Every Friday, he sent Olivia an email updating her on his progress, never asking to see the boys, never demanding anything, just proving through consistency that he could show up even when showing up earned him nothing except the distant possibility of future consideration. She never responded to those emails, but he knew she read them because occasionally she'd mention details from them when they had their monthly phone calls, brief conversations about child development and co-parenting philosophy that felt like final exams he was constantly studying for without knowing if he'd pass. The first supervised visit happened on a Saturday morning 8 months after that stormy night, and Noah showed up 30 minutes early too. The public park Olivia had chosen. His hands shaking so badly he had to sit on a bench and practice breathing exercises his therapist had taught him for managing anxiety without reverting to control tactics. Olivia arrived pushing a double stroller with Eli and Aaron strapped in like tiny astronauts, both boys bigger now, their features more defined. And Noah felt tears sting his eyes because he'd missed months of development, months of first words and first steps, months that could never be recovered no matter how hard he worked to earn the future. She lifted them out one at a time and set them on a blanket she'd spread across the grass, and they immediately started crawling toward scattered toys while Noah watched from a respectful distance, terrified to move closer without permission, terrified that any wrong gesture would end this opportunity before it began. "You can sit with them," Olivia said after a minute of watching him hover like a ghost at his own children's lives. "They're not going to break, and you're not going to learn how to be their father from 6 feet away." Noah lowered himself onto the blanket with movements, so careful he might have been approaching wild animals. And Aaron looked up at him with curious eyes that held no recognition, no understanding that this stranger was the source of half his genetic code. He held out a toy car to Noah with the generous instinct of toddlers who haven't yet learned to hoard, and Noah took it with trembling fingers, rolling it back across the blanket while something in his chest cracked open and started bleeding light instead of darkness. Family, have you ever held something precious that you almost lost forever, felt the weight of second chances in your hands, and understood that gratitude is just another word for the terror of almost missing out on the only thing that actually matters? Eli crawled into Noah's lap without warning or ceremony, just decided this strange man's legs looked comfortable and settled there like he belonged, and Noah froze completely, barely breathing, afraid that moving would shatter whatever spell had made his son trust him even fractionally. Olivia watched from her position on the edge of the blanket, her expression unreadable, but her posture less rigid than before, and Noah met her eyes over Eli's head with a look that tried to communicate everything words couldn't. Gratitude and regret and desperate hope all compressed into a single moment of eye contact. The visit lasted 45 minutes, shorter than Noah wanted, but longer than he'd expected. And when Olivia started packing up the toys, he helped without being asked, learning the routine, trying to prove he could be useful instead of just present. "Same time next week," Olivia said as she loaded the twins back into their stroller. And those 4 words felt like a reprieve from a death sentence, like proof that consistency was working, that showing up even when it earned him almost nothing was slowly building something that might eventually resemble trust. Noah drove home to his modest apartment with tears streaming down his face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that he'd spent 36 years chasing the wrong definition of success, measuring worth in dollars and deals instead of moments like watching his son hold a toy car or feeling small fingers grab his shirt. The weekly visits became bi-weekly, then moved to Olivia's house, where Noah would arrive with groceries. He'd offer to cook into meals they'd eat together, while the twins smeared food across their high chairs, and Noah learned that love was messy and exhausting and nothing like the controlled transactions he'd once mistaken for relationships. He started staying after dinner to help with bath time, learning how to test water temperature and wash tiny bodies without getting soap in their eyes. And Olivia would supervise from the doorway, watching him struggle and improve, watching him fail and try again, watching him slowly transform from the monster she'd fled into something that resembled a work in progress. On the twins' second birthday, Noah showed up with modest gifts, nothing extravagant or showy, just things he'd noticed they needed during his visits. And when Aaron called him Dada, for the first time it was probably just random syllables. But Noah's knees buckled anyway, and Olivia had to look away, because seeing him break down over a word most fathers took for granted reminded her that maybe people could change if the motivation was strong enough and the consequences had been devastating. Enough to teach them. Family. Can true love survive pride and betrayal and years of separation? Can a man who treated someone like property ever learn to treat them like a partner? And if you were Olivia, would you risk your heart again on someone who'd already proven what they were capable of destroying? Winter turned to spring while Noah continued showing up, continued doing the work, continued proving that his transformation wasn't performance, but actual fundamental rewiring of how he understood connection and value and what made life worth living. He got promoted at work, but didn't tell Olivia for weeks, because he'd learned that impressing her required different metrics than impressing boardrooms. Required showing up exhausted and still patient with the twins. Required admitting when he didn't know how to handle something instead of pretending competence he didn't possess. One evening after the twins had fallen asleep on the couch during a movie, Noah carefully transferred them to their beds while Olivia watched from the hallway. And when he emerged from their room, she was still standing there with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're different," she said quietly, not quite an accusation, but not quite a compliment either. Just an observation that required response. The Noah I knew would have hired someone to put them to bed, would have seen their needs as an interruption rather than the actual point. He nodded because she was right, because the man he'd been with would have missed this entire experience by delegating it to nannies and assistants, would have remained a stranger to his own children while congratulating himself on providing for them financially. "I built empires out of greed," Noah said, the confession coming easier now after months of therapy and humility. "I measured success by how much I could take from the world, how many people I could control, how high I could climb by stepping on everyone below me. And I called that strength when really it was just fear dressed up in expensive suits." He gestured around Olivia's modest living room with its second-hand furniture and children's toys scattered across the floor. "This," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "You, them, these moments when Aaron falls asleep on my shoulder or Eli laughs at something silly I did. This is the only empire that matters. And it took losing everything to finally understand that love isn't something you buy or negotiate or control. It's something you earn by showing up even when showing up costs you everything else." Olivia stepped closer, close enough that Noah could smell her shampoo. Close enough that he could see tears gathering in her eyes, even though her expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she said, and the honesty was both crushing and liberating, because at least it was truth instead of polite pretense. "I may never be ready to forgive you for what you did, for how you made me feel, for the years I spent believing I was worthless because you treated me like I was." Noah's instinct was to defend himself, to explain or justify or minimize. But therapy had taught him that accepting consequences without arguing was its own form of respect. So he just nodded and waited for her to finish. "But," she continued, and that single word carried more weight than entire speeches, "I can see you're trying. I can see you've changed. And these boys deserve a father who's capable of loving them more than he loved himself. So if you keep showing up, if you keep doing the work, maybe eventually we can build something that doesn't look like our past." She reached up and touched his face, just her fingertips against his jaw. And the gesture was so tender it nearly destroyed him, because he didn't deserve tenderness, didn't deserve grace, didn't deserve anything except the consequences he'd spent months accepting. "Welcome home, Noah," Olivia whispered, and the words didn't mean he was forgiven, or that they were together, or that the past was erased. They just meant he'd earned the right to keep trying, to keep showing up, to keep proving that people could transform if they wanted it badly enough and worked hard enough, and stopped making excuses for the damage they caused. They stood there in her living room while rain tapped against windows, and their son slept peacefully down the hall. And Noah understood that this was what winning actually looked like, not penthouses and profit margins, but just being allowed to exist in the same space as the people who mattered, being trusted with the ordinary sacred moments that money could never buy. Family, the richest man in the world, isn't the one with the biggest bank account or the most impressive empire. It's the one who finally learns that love is the only currency that matters, that showing up is the only success worth measuring, and that sometimes losing everything is exactly what it takes to find out what you should have been holding on to all along. So tell me, can a man like Noah Bennett truly change? Would you take him back if you were Olivia? And what does redemption actually cost when you've spent years being someone's villain? Comment below and let me know, because stories like this don't end. They just teach us what happens when pride meets humility and destruction finally learns the language of creation. Thanks for watching. Do not forget to subscribe to my channel and drop your comment. May God bless you all. See you in the next video.